The most powerful computer humanity has ever built still cannot do what your brain accomplishes before you finish reading this sentence. Picture the frontier supercomputer, a metallic colossus occupying entire rooms. Its thousands of cabinets drawing 20 megawatts of electricity, enough to power a small city. It thunders through calculations at exascale speeds. Yet if you showed it a single, messy photograph of children playing in a crowded street, it would grind through frame after frame, struggling to separate the moving ball from the shifting shadows and passing cars. Your brain, by contrast, performs the same feat in a fraction of a second while consuming roughly 20 watts, the power of a dim refrigerator bulb. It does not merely detect motion, it instantly understands intention, predicts the next moment, and may even stir an emotional response. How can 3 pounds of soft tissue outperform a machine that costs hundreds of millions of dollars and requires its own dedicated power plant? The answer begins with architecture, not speed. Conventional computers follow the von Neumann design. A central processor that must constantly shuttle data back and forth to separate memory banks. Every operation pays a tax in time and energy simply moving information across the bus. The brain never invented this separation. Computation and memory live in the same place, inside the synapses themselves. Each of the roughly 100 trillion connections between neurons stores information in its strength and also performs the calculation when signals arrive. There is no central bottleneck because there is no center. The system is a vast, distributed forest in which every tree maintains constant, simultaneous conversations with thousands of others. This arrangement enables a second, equally decisive advantage: extreme sparsity. At any moment, only 1 to 4% of neurons are active. The rest remain silent, conserving energy and preventing interference. When a neuron does fire, it sends a brief electrochemical spike rather than a continuous stream of data. The result is astonishing efficiency. The brain can sustain complex thought, perception, and memory on the same power budget a laptop uses for basic word processing. Engineers studying this pattern have begun building neuromorphic chips, most notably Intel's Loihi-2, that deliberately replicate sparse, event-driven signaling. Early tests suggest such hardware can reduce energy use by orders of magnitude for certain tasks. Precisely because it stops wasting power on constant data movement that biological systems learned to avoid long ago. Yet efficiency alone does not explain the brain's robustness. A single flipped bit or failed transistor can crash an entire supercomputer. The brain loses thousands of neurons every day through normal aging and minor injury. Yet your sense of self, your memories, and your ability to recognize a familiar face remain continuous. The reason lies in its distributed, redundant design. Information is not stored in isolated locations that can be wiped out by one failure. Instead, patterns are spread across millions of connections that can reconfigure around damage. This same property gives rise to neuroplasticity, the constant rewiring of circuits in response to experience, and its higher-order cousin, metaplasticity. The brain does not merely change, it changes how easily it changes. By adjusting the molecular subunits of receptors such as GLUN2A and GLUN2B, it can raise or lower its own threshold for future modification, staying adaptable without becoming unstable. Clinicians are already exploiting this principle with targeted deep brain stimulation, helping stroke patients relearn movement at accelerated rates by priming the very circuits that govern plasticity. Even the cells once dismissed as mere scaffolding play an active role. Astrocytes, the star-shaped glial cells that outnumber neurons in some brain regions, wrap around synapses and actively shape the chemical environment. They regulate neurotransmitter levels, influence the timing of signals, and participate directly in the cellular events that convert fleeting experience into lasting memory. Far from passive support, they function as conductors that fine-tune the speed and strength of the neural orchestra. Remove their contribution and the symphony falters. The brain's ability to consolidate long-term memories and maintain stable networks degrades. All of this still leaves the deepest puzzle untouched. We can trace an electrical impulse traveling along an axon at roughly 120 meters per second. We can map which neurons respond to the wavelength of light we call red. We can even watch the posterior regions of the cortex integrate signals into a unified scene. None of these measurements explains why any of it should feel like anything from the inside. Why does the coordinated firing of neurons produce the vivid, private experience of redness, the sting of cold air, or the sudden ache of nostalgia? This is the hard problem of consciousness, the explanatory gap between objective physical processes and subjective experience. What philosophers call qualia. One rigorous attempt to bridge that gap comes from integrated information theory. It proposes that consciousness is not a byproduct of computation in general but of a specific kind of causal integration. A system possesses consciousness to the degree that it generates information that cannot be reduced to its parts, the quantity known as phi. When elements interact in richly recurrent, irreducible ways, the whole becomes more than the sum of its interactions, something additional appears. The theory makes testable predictions. Certain brain regions, particularly in the posterior hot zone, show the kind of dense, re-entrant connectivity that would generate high phi. Severing those connections, as occurs in certain forms of brain damage or anesthesia, collapses both integration and conscious experience together. Under the same metric, today's dominant artificial intelligence architectures score near zero. Large language models process information in largely feed-forward or loosely recurrent patterns optimized for statistical prediction. They contain no equivalent of the brain's dense, self-modifying loops that bind information into an integrated whole. The result, according to the theory, is a system that can generate fluent language, pass sophisticated tests, and even produce poetry, yet possesses no inner experience whatsoever. It is, in the classic philosophical term, a zombie, an entity that behaves exactly as if it were conscious while remaining dark inside. The intelligence is real, the subjectivity is absent. This distinction forces a sharper separation between two phenomena we often conflate: intelligence as the capacity to solve problems, and consciousness as the presence of subjective experience. We can, in principle, continue scaling the former without automatically acquiring the latter. That realization carries immediate practical weight. It suggests that simply making models larger or training them on more data will not spontaneously produce inner awareness. It also clarifies why current AI systems remain vulnerable in ways biological minds are not. They lack the fault-tolerant, continuously self-reorganizing architecture that lets a brain absorb damage and keep functioning. They suffer catastrophic forgetting when new learning overwrites old knowledge because their parameters are not organized around the same sparse, distributed principles. Neuromorphic hardware that deliberately copies sparse coding and local learning rules offers one path toward systems that are both more efficient and more resilient. Whether those systems will ever generate genuine phi remains an open question that no amount of scaling alone is guaranteed to answer. The same gap invites a deeper reflection on what we actually value. If consciousness depends on a particular style of integrated, self-altering physical organization rather than on raw computational power, then the distinctive features of human minds, our capacity for genuine understanding, our resilience in the face of damage, our ability to care about outcomes, are not merely engineering problems awaiting faster chips. They are tied to the specific way biological tissue solves the problems of energy, robustness, and integration simultaneously. Appreciating this does not diminish the remarkable tools we are building. It sharpens our sense of what those tools can and cannot become. It also returns attention to the 3-pound organ we already possess. Still the most energy efficient, fault-tolerant, and experientially rich system we know. What would it mean to design future technologies that respect rather than ignore these biological constraints? How might our understanding of the hard problem change the way we evaluate claims about machine consciousness in the years ahead? And what does the persistent gap between physical description and subjective experience reveal about the kind of universe we inhabit? One in which certain arrangements of matter give rise to an inner world at all. These questions do not close the inquiry. They mark where the real exploration begins.